Since I started reading 1.5 years ago, I have read over 35 books in those 1.5 years. And if you would go on my Goodreads account, my kind of standard reading, standard measurement, my standard review for good books is 4 stars. Because it is not like enough for 5 stars because like normal books don't really change my life. But there are quite a few books which I have read, which I have given this like 5 star review, and those books have fundamentally changed my life. And so today we're going to go through all of those books which I have gave this 5 star review, so meaning the books that have changed my life. And also an important note here, I will go first through all of the self-help books, through all of the like the self-improvement, self-development books, and then we'll switch on to the fiction ones. And also there will be a lot of Russian literature there. And since I know the language perfectly, I can speak Russian as Russian is my native language. Those books will be in Russian. So this is just kind of like a side note. So the first book on this list is going to be 12 Rules for Life by Jordan Peterson. So 12 I have read the first time I have read this book was more than a year ago by now, and I have read it twice. And what I can say is that it is perhaps the best self-improvement book which has been written in the last, let's just say, 10 years. Because like this is not a trivial point right here, because like I have read a lot of self-improvement, self-development, and this genre in general is pretty hard to navigate because like everybody can write a book these days on how, like, on the mindset, on like how to think and etc on those topics, but none of those books really matter. And I have read this kind of literature and it didn't really help me at all. Why 12 Rules for Life? First of all, I have made a full-on 1.5 hour review. It is in 2 parts on my channel, which you can watch in my book series playlist. And I have analyzed every single rule in details in those 2 videos. And basically, if you live up to those 12 rules, which are not like they're not something new, they're not rocket science. It's just like you need to hammer this book in your mind, because some of the people I just found that like this book is insanely popular. It's like you can see this book being sold in, like, I don't know, airport stores, and like, I don't know, you get the point. It's like it is ubiquitous. And a lot of people, they just read this book once and then put it on the bookshelf because, like, you read it once and you get it all. No, you read it once and you understand that there are like some 12 rules which you need to kind of live by. This book, you need to read it like at least a couple of times to like confidently say that you understood it, because like I have read it 2 times and I have understood it more than the average person. But of course, like, I'm far from understanding it fully, because this book, even though those 12 rules, as I said, they're not something like rocket science, they weren't invented by Pearson. Those 12 rules, if you live up to them, your life will change fundamentally. And I have also read the sequel of this book, so Beyond Order by Jordan Peterson. This is the second book in this 12 Rules for Life series, meaning that there are 24 rules already. I read it once, it didn't really like, look, the rules there are amazing. Like, there, when I was reading them, they kind of like, look, it is hard to explain because like I haven't read this book multiple times to speak confidently about understanding it. I haven't understood it all. I have read it once. I'm not a guru in this book. I'm not an expert to tell you that, like, oh, this book is going to be life changing if you read it. Because, like, as I said, I have read it once, but from what I have analyzed, when I have stopped reading this book, like when I have analyzed the rules that are in this book, if you just give it a little bit more time, if you read it a couple of times, if you really live up to those rules, as with the first book, you'll gain so much understanding of how a great life, how to live a great life, how to live a life of meaning, how to live a life of fulfillment, that skipping the sequel is unacceptable, honestly. So the next book on this list is going to be The Almanac of Naval Ravikant. So Naval Ravikant is this Indian American entrepreneur and philosopher. I don't know if like I can call him a philosopher, but let's just. And this book is a kind of like, what do you call it? It's a kind of like an interview of him. And this book is divided in two parts. So the first part is on building wealth, and the second part is on building happiness. And you know, the wealth part is timeless. It is absolutely timeless. He didn't give any like secrets or anything like new. He just gave the fundamental basics of how money, how wealth works, how like what is the sort of like psychology of wealth and money. Because like, you know, building things like wealth and money, they don't require something like new or something just like nuanced. Basically, what you need to remember, and this is from Naval's own words, you have some timeless lessons on how to build those things. And all you need to do is to remember those timeless lessons. So, what is the difference between money and wealth? How the market works? What do people want? What subjects do you need to study in order to make money, etc. So this part I kind of like, I read it through, but I but I don't remember all of the things because like I wasn't really focused on the wealth part. It wasn't really the reason why I bought this book. I bought this book of because of like the second part on happiness. And this one, it has really changed my life. Because, first of all, what Naval says is that we should, and this is kind of like, it was a new concept for me that we should prioritize happiness. And prioritizing happiness, like, it's never really a thing in the self improvement, self development space. So, this was already a, kind of like a new idea for me. And then he goes on to talk about like what practices should you have, how should you think, what books should you read on in order to build happiness in your life, what philosophy should you have, etc. So this is kind of like a general 101 education on how to be a happy person. And you know, it may sound trivial, but this book, the way Naval Ravikant explains how to build happiness and also wealth is very understandable. You can readily understand all of the things that he's saying, and it's also very practical. So there is no woo woo, wishy washy, fairy airy stuff in there. It is all practical, all understandable. This book has changed my life, certainly. Now, moving on to the next book, it is not precisely it is not like a self-help self-improvement book. It is a philosophy book. And you know, I don't really count it in this like self-help group, but still I think it should be on this list. It is perhaps one of the most life-changing books that I have ever read, and it is Meditations by Max Aurelius. So the Meditations is, if you don't know, if you haven't read, if you don't know anything about Max Aurelius, which I highly doubt because this book has just like, it is insanely popular right now. Like everybody has read it. This book is a collection of Marcus's private journals. So you like if you don't know who Marcus Aurelius is, he was the former emperor of Rome. And one of the things that really strikes you when you read this book is that how the most powerful man in the world at that time, how the man who could be corrupt, who could be hedonistic, who could value instant pleasure over the wealth of the state and the nation. How could this man focus on things like justice, on courage, on stoicism, on virtues? How did he do that? What was his philosophy? And Meditations, as I said, is a collection of Marx's private journals. And this book, I have read it twice by now. It is the first time you read this book, you understand nothing. Honestly, you just understand nothing. I can explain it like quite readily. The first time I have read it, I took like something like 9 or 11 notes, so quite a few. The second time I have read it, I took something like 60. And probably the third time that I will read it, I will take even more. Maybe not even more, but I'll get more from this book that I have read, like, than what I have read in the first and the second time combined. And the way that the way that this book changes you is not through preaching, because like meditations, it's a collection of Marx's private journals. So this book was never intended to be published, but in he writes in this sort of very how do you even call it, practical but at the same time inspirational way, which allows you to understand how to implement those virtues in your life, how to actually implement stoicism in your life. I don't recommend, though, to read this book as your first introduction to stoicism, because this book is, as I said, it is, despite being quite practical, it is not practical enough for you to understand it. So I would say read something like Epictetus's these discourses first. Maybe read some Seneca, but Marcus Aurelius, read him a little bit later, although Meditations is, of course, life changing. And on the topic of Stoicism and Marcus Aurelius, and specifically, the book How to Think Like a Roman Emperor has also been quite life changing. I have made a full review on my channel quite recently about this book. And basically, in short details, it is an explanation of Marcus's biography, and also it is an explanation of Stoicism. And the way this book is written is Donald Robertson, the author of this book, he, as I said, he explains Marx, he writes about like the biography of Marcus Aurelius, but also how he implemented Stoicism and all of those Stoic lessons throughout his life. And you know, it is, if you think about it, it's a very hard thing to do, to implement it in one book, to explain Stoicism and the way you implement it, as I said, in just one book. But this is exactly what this book is about. It is a perfect example. Marcus Aurelius is a perfect example of how somebody who had so many adversities and challenges and obstacles and unrest in his life, how could he implement stoicism and, you know, calmness in his life? How could he implement this rationality towards certain events in his life? This is a really good book. So, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, certainly going to be on this list. And the last book on this self-help slash philosophy list is the book that I have finished reading the day before yesterday, and it is also about stoicism. And what is good about this book is that you can read it in the afternoon. It is very short. It is the whole book is 100 and something like pages. So you can read it in a day, but more than that, it is divided into three sort of like parts, which not into three parts, but three separate documents. So you can read the main document, you can read it in like an hour or so. And it is Seneca's On the Shortness of Life. So on the short basically in this book, Seneca explains why our lives are not as short as we think they are, as we think it is, but how the reason why we think our lives are short is that we waste a an insane and inadequate amount of it. So you get the point. We have actually a pretty long life as humans. Something like the average lifespan is something like 80 years. But, and I mean the Western countries, but we just waste a lot of our lives. We just waste a lot of this precious time thinking that we have a lot of time on this earth. And this is kind of like this like mental paradox, which in the end leads to a short life because like a good chunk of our lives have been wasted and we haven't lived throughout it. We have just existed. So this is a book which in a sort of way it is very preachy, which you know, in this case, it is good. It is good that Seneca, because like first of all, this book is not even a book. It's like a letter to his friends. But the way it shapes your character is throughout hammering this idea that life isn't short. It's just like you waste it. The way it hammers this idea in your mind is very good. So now we move on to the classic literature. So the fiction, the classics, you get the point. And the first book on this list, I'm actually rereading it right now. And this is a very classic, this is just a world classic book, and it is 1984 by George Orwell. And this book, we're not going to talk about the nature of totalitarianism and states and anything political. This book, the way it changes your life is that it gives you very much a good perspective and a good view on how certain aspects of human nature work, like love, hate, torture. Because like I'm not going to try to spoiler in this book because like you should read it yourself. But for example, on the nature of love, in the world of 1984, anything which is akin to romantic love is forbidden. It is punished by death. And the way the main character, Winston Smith, and you know, the second main character, Julia, the way they love each other in those circumstances, it shows that perhaps love is something that you cannot suppress, and even in those circumstances. So it gives you a very, very good understanding of how love works. With hate, things like 2 minute hate, the examples of hate in this book will be of course, the infamous 2 minute hate, which is a process, kind of like it's an event where people just gather up to hate people, to hate countries, to hate things. The way hate is portrayed in this book, it is of course on the state level, on the personal level, it is somewhat terrifying. And the nature of torture, the nature of, and this where I'm going to give you a little spoiler. It is not a direct spoiler, but this book, it places it places the question that, can you break a person? Can you break a person's morals, ideas, worldview under torture? Can you do that? Not from a like, because I have listened to a lot of explanations and videos about this book, and even though if we were talking about like the real world, the neuroscience of torturing is, it kind of shows that you cannot break a person under torture. This book shows you something else, which is, you should kind of take it into the equation. And this is going to be one little spoiler I'll give you. I'm not going to say anything more. 1984 by George Orwell. Certainly a book which is life changing. The next book is, I can make a case that it is my favorite book ever written. You can make a case that it is the best book ever written, like in the history of humanity, and it is The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. So I have read this book in Russian because, like as I said, I can speak the language, and it's kind of like one of those brick books which it took me a little bit more than a month to read it, but it is certainly a book that when you read it, you become a whole new different person. Like me before reading this book and me after is just like, it's mentally, it's two different people. And of course this book places the fundamental questions, like what is religion, what is God, who is a good man, what makes a good man, should you be religious in order to be a good man. This constant, this first of all, the main one of the main characters in this book is Alyosha Karamazov, and Alyosha is a religious, he's first of all, he's a religious person, and he's being portrayed as this noble, very, I wouldn't say saint-like, but a very, yeah, as a very nice, as a very good, as a very, you get the point. He's a very benevolent character, and there is a kind of like an opposite to this character, which is Ivan Karamazov, and he's been portrayed as this atheist, materialist character, and this constant contradiction between those two worldviews, between those two values of being religious or being a rational atheist materialist. This there is all, and this story unfolds, this kind of rivalry, I wouldn't say rivalry because like it is not that, but this constant comparison of those two worldviews unfolds in spite of in spite of like a family tragedy with the death of father of the death of Fyodor Karamazov, and also the, yeah, it's a word, I'm not going to try to spoil because like I have spoiled already many things right here. This book is, it is hard to read morally. It is a very tough book, especially on the parts I think with like with this kid's part with Ilya, with Ilyusha. I don't know how it will be translated into English, how they will translate this name, but with the death of this little kid, with his father, it is a very hard. It is a very hard book in terms of reading it in this like moral sense. But this is a book which you can make a case that it is the greatest book ever written. I would certainly agree on that In a couple of weeks, I'll start reading Crime and Punishment. So no, I'll have a sort of like a I could make a comparison between those two books in quite a few weeks. And by now, I can certainly say Boris Karamazov is certainly my favorite book. It is certainly the book that has changed me the most. So, out of all of those books which I have reviewed, the Brothers Karamazov is certainly going to be the book that has changed my life. And the last book on this list is also a Russian classic, and it is Fathers and Sons by Ivan Turgenev. And this book is it is kind of like a deep dive into the philosophy of nihilism, because the main character in this book, Evgeny Bazarov, he's this student nihilist. He believes in nothing. He believes that nothing should matter, nothing has matter, and nothing, like, you get the point. He's a full-on nihilist. And the way Turgenev unfolds the story, the way he makes the main character, because throughout reading this book, you can certainly say that Turgenev despises Bazarov. You can certainly make a case that he's Bazarov is a sort of like a malevolent character rather than a benevolent one. But there's a sort of irony in this book with that happens with Bazarov. I wanted to spoiler this book, but I'm not going to. This is a book that you should read yourself. And I I never intended to be a nihilist. I never was a nihilist, so this book didn't change my perspective on this philosophy, but it gives you a very good understanding of what happens. And what happened to Bazarov is it is not a consequence of his philosophy, but you can certainly make a case that it is somewhat ironic what happened to him. And Ivan Turgenev certainly with Fathers and Sons, it is the book that has changed my life.